I'm beginning by making the A2 chassis. This is etched substantially in brass, very accurately, and as you can see, some preparation has already taken place. The bearings have to go in. Now, I cleared the holes for these with a number 26 bit in a pillar drill. I find that the more convenient method. However, a large reamer should do just as well. Now, as you can see, I've already fitted the bearings to one side and most of them to the other side. These are 1/8 top hat bearings available from markets. They are supplied anyway in the kit. So that just goes on there. Now I'm applying flux. This is a liquid phosphoric acid flux. Try not to breathe it. And the solder I'm using is 145 melting point. I clean the end of the iron, take a small amount of solder on the end of the bit, hold everything still. Now the trick is to let the solder do the work. Don't move around with the iron. Let it flow all the way around. Now the type of gearbox I'm fitting will be explained later, but it's a very, very snug fit between the frames. So what I have to do on the center one is just clear the edge of the bearing so that none of it protrudes through. A nice test, by the way, I hope you can see, is you get a ring of solder. That means the joint is sound. It just comes through to the outside. So very briefly, I'll just remove the edge of the bearing. It has no effect on the running qualities. You're only losing a tiny bit of the actual bearing. Just file it smooth. Fairly coarse file to begin with. You'll see the solder disappearing with the edge of the bearing. And then clean up with a finer file. So you end up with a very nice flush finish, just so that the gearbox can drop in. I've now started putting the frames together. Very often in frames you will get turn spacers which are held together by screws, and that will be explained on the Southeastern Finecast 262 Great Western kit. In the case of this A2, the things are held together by spacers fitted into slots. So I'm employing a jig. This is an old Jameson jig. And the idea of this jig is, I hope you can see, it will allow you to make sure the axles are at right angles to the frames. You can see there's some little movement there. There's not much. The thing is very well etched, but just to ensure that the axles are in exactly the right relative positions. And to make sure that everything is square, I'm going to put this on a piece of mirror glass. Mirror glass is absolutely dead flat, and I suggest every workshop have an old mirror. The mirror glass is absolutely dead flat. By pressing gently, making sure that the chassis is absolutely flat both sides, you've got a much better chance then of a free running chassis. When you're happy, lift it off. Reintroduce the iron, again more flux, keep the iron there, let it cool slightly, check once again with the mirror that nothing has moved. When happy, go back and do the rear spacer. Care is absolutely essential at this stage, because a chassis out of square is never ever going to work. Let the solder flow. Don't move the iron too much. Now the measure of any good soldered joint is you should be able to see it through the other side. So if you look there and look there, it's coming through. You can go back to the inside as many times as you wish, although most of the time it's unnecessary. But a good joint should show through on the opposite side. Whatever you do, don't dwell too long with the iron, otherwise you will unsolder what you've already done. But can you see? I hope you can see. It's coming through both sides. We can then dispense with a jig. That's done its job. You'll find it's still warm, but your asbestos fingers should be doing well. And you've got then basically a square chassis ready for the next stage. I hope that it's clear that you can see the solder has actually come through. The iron was applied to the underneath of this spacer and the solder has come right through, making a nice, crisp, neat line. That is a very, very strong joint. When you're happy that chassis is true and square, next job is to ream the bearings. And here I'm using a 1/8 taper reamer. In many ways this shouldn't be necessary. The bearings should be 1/8 clearance, but I always find they're very, very slightly tight usually. The tool will automatically find its own center. Go very, very slowly and easily, just passing it through from both sides. It will give a perfect working clearance. Whatever you do, don't use a mouse tail file. All you'll do is file in inaccuracy. I'm going to be using Romford wheels for this chassis. These are the easiest to fit. They're Romford, their current name is Markets, but they're the same thing. And they have a screw-in crank pin system. And I'm going to be using the special Romford screwdriver for this job. As you can see, the end is hollow and it fits over the end of the crank pin. Don't screw the crank pins in too tightly, just so they fit neatly and tightly. The pins have tiny little slots either side which engage on the end of the screwdriver. Just for added security, if you wish, a small smear of glue, super glue, on the end of the crank pin will do the job when you've finished. Now these are proper LNER 6'2" wheels, Market's latest products. And I'm just going to temporarily fit them to the chassis. Now quartering, proper quartering is essential, but for this purpose at this stage we don't need to bother too much. It doesn't matter in that respect, just so long as we get the wheels on for test purposes. Now I hope you can see by reaming that axle it's beautifully free. There's no interference there, neither is there any slop. It's what we call a perfect working clearance. Now already just on this piece of board we can see that there's no rock whatsoever. All the precautions we took making the chassis accurately with the aid of the jigs paying off. I'm now going to transfer it onto the piece of glass, the mirror glass, just to check that it is true. Now I hope you can see there's absolutely no rock on that whatsoever. That's dead true, it's dead flat. Now although this is no guarantee of true running, at least it's a very, very good start. If the chassis were out of square and there were rocking, you'd have no hope of ever having a sweetly running locomotive. Our next job is to remove the wheels and paint the chassis after I've added various bits and pieces, brakes and what have you. But already we have the beginnings of a true and accurate chassis, testament to sound design and I hope good working practices. We're happy now that our chassis is true, the axle holes have been reamed, everything's nice and square. What remains to be done is the end of basic detailing before we go to paint the chassis. This is a Pacific chassis, which means it's a 462. It has a bogie at the front and a pony at the rear. Now to fix those on, which will be a later job, we need to make sure that the fixings are on at this stage. And what I'm going to use is a simple 8BA nut. The hole is provided there. The instructions tell you that's where it goes. Now, this is a useful dodge, a ubiquitous cocktail stick. I mentioned earlier that you burn your fingers. Well, here's a way where you avoid that. You force the 8BA nut on, place it over the hole, and you'll find that the end of the cocktail stick will fix very nicely into the hole. Plenty of flux. Pick up the solder, again, rest it next to the work. Don't move the iron about too much and you'll find that eventually the heat will flow through and all around the base of the nut. Obviously don't dwell forever, otherwise your carefully soldered in spacer will become detached. Now, it's a law of sod that it's all too easy to remove the cocktail stick before the solder has solidified. It's also a rule that the solder will solidify in moments after you've let go when you can't stand the pain. So it's always best, whenever you think it is, give it just a few more seconds. Take that out. Now, unless you're very, very lucky, the threads will be clogged with solder. If they are, it means a very good joint anyway. So using an 8BA tap wrench, all you do, carefully retap the hole. If nothing else, it will test your soldering. As with any tapping, don't do it all at once. Turn it back to release the swarf, and then you'll find it will go through nice and easily. Amazingly, the joint hasn't failed. We've retapped the hole. That will never come adrift. And if you look now, we've got our rear bearing, rear fixing for the pony truck and our front fixing for the bogie. They will be fitted by shouldered screws, and I'll be attending to that later on. The final soldering job on the basic chassis, in the case of this A2, is to fit the brakes. Now, I fitted the first two hangers. In the instructions, this is rather implied that these are fitted after the wheels. I don't agree with that personally. I'd sooner keep the soldering iron as far away from the wheels as possible at every stage. Once again, the ubiquitous cocktail stick. These fit neatly into slots. Again, plenty of flux. Run the solder across. Cocktail stick prevents you burning your fingers. Once again, make sure the solder has solidified. It has. Take that out, and it's slightly reminiscent of a Phoenician or Roman galley. But I hope you can see the joints have been made very well. The solder has come through, right the way through. When the wheels are finally fitted, after the chassis is painted, I'll just bend down those brake hangers and fit the shoes. The brake hangers make very convenient positions for fixing on the pickup pads. We have to devise some method of getting electricity from the rails to the motor. This is the method I prefer. Others prefer others, but this consists of pieces of printed circuit board cut to length, placed in position on top of that spacer, and I use a small amount of super glue, cyano glue. Easiest method of getting any is to put a small amount on the end of a piece of wire, touch it next to the pickup pad, a little bit more around the other side. It will flash in. This is low viscosity and you'll find it will just flash in. Now, pickup pads are secured, basic soldering is finished, everything on that chassis now is ready for painting. So that's the next stage on this particular chassis. This is the basic chassis for the Allen Gibson 4F. Very accurately etched, very accurate in every way. However, slightly more difficult to put together because there are no holes or tabs to fit the spacers. So a jig of some description is absolutely essential here. I'd already fixed the spacers to one half of the chassis frame. Jig makes sure that the axles are all in alignment and everything is nice and square. So I just proceed to solder up the other side frame. As I say, try to avoid breathing the fumes from the flux. It's phosphoric acid and it gives off a rather noxious pong when it's heated up. You must have flux though. You won't make any decent solder joint without the flux. As before, turn it over, check, solder has come through, check everything is still nice and square. Nice joints, a little bit there, which I'll have to clean off. Do that with a file. And where you have any sort of rough patches, fiberglass burnishing stick, very useful just for cleaning up. Slightly more difficult to assemble, but only slightly. Using a jig will present no problems. Nice and square, that should go together very well henceforth. I'm moving now on to building the Southeastern Finecast 61XX chassis. All of the things that I've described for the A2 and the 4F chassis have already been done on this chassis, and it's also been painted. And it's ready now to take the wheels, motor, pickups and see if we can get it to work. For fixing wheels to the 61XX chassis, I'm using Romford Market's latest wheels. You'll note that they have the webbing between the spokes. But you have to have an insulated wheel, at least one insulated wheel. And they're available as either insulated or non-insulated. And the way to tell is there is a very, very fine paper washer between the tyre and the Mazak centre. Now, that's absolutely crucial that you identify that. The insulated wheels go on one side. They all have to go on the same side. The non-insulated wheels have to go on the opposite side. One trick I use is to fit the axles always to the insulated wheels first. Now, I fitted the first pair of wheels, and Great Western locomotives had what is called right-hand lead. By that I mean, if the left-hand crank is top dead centre, then the right-hand crank must be 90 degrees forward. 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock. That's the insulated side, chassis turned upside down. In order to make sure that the wheels don't slop about too much, I use Pico 1/8 insulated washers. 2 on the insulated side. It's absolutely essential that the insulated wheels don't touch the chassis, because the chassis will be live, electrically live, to the non-insulated side. So all the insulated wheels have to go on the same side. I've deliberately made the front restricted clearance, because eventually cylinders, outside valve gear, or connecting rods, crossheads and piston rods all have to go in front of this wheel. And if there's too much slop, you're going to end up with interference problems later. So let's make sure our insulated wheel goes on the same side. I'm going to use one fibre washer for the non-insulated side. Do a very, very rapid check. 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 3 o'clock. Push the wheel on. Now if you're very lucky, these will screw up with no fuss whatsoever. If, like me, more often than not, they ping across the floor, you can get replacements from markets. Tighten the wheel. On. Have another check. Right hand, by the way, means as if you were the driver looking forwards. That's the front of the locomotive. This is the rear. Left hand side, 12 o'clock, both sides. Right hand side, 3 o'clock. So we've got the quartering right so far. The centre axle is where I'm going to put the motor, and that requires something slightly different, as I will be very soon explaining. For all three models, I'm using DJH gearboxes with Mishima motors. These can be supplied like this one, ready-made up, or they are available as kits. Obviously, the ready-made ones are more expensive. They are excellent. They run very, very well. There are others, of course. Comet makes some very nice boxes. Andy Mullins of Branch Lines, he too makes a very, very good box. Some people use Porter's caps. I find the Grand Spot DJH box is very, very good indeed. Whatever chassis you make, particularly 6-couple chassis, the best drive is always on the centre axle, because that way everything is balanced out. Now this is where you need 3 hands, is to fit the gearbox and the wheel and the axle through the chassis, through the sides of the gearbox, through the gear wheel and back into the other side. Now it is a fiddle and it falls out umpteen times and it rolls all over the floor, and you will develop a new vocabulary, but it does fix. Now one of the things you must ensure is that that's nice and free at this stage. If you have any binding, tight spots before any drive is applied, then you're finished. That should be almost as smooth. It won't be quite as smooth as the ordinary axles because you've got a lot more bearing surface, but that should be nice and free with no interference. That's quite happy. Check again. Insulated wheels on that side. Always check. Check again. Turn that round. The wheels at 12 o'clock. Turn that over. I'm giving a bit more side play to the centre axle. The advantage of a gearbox allows that. Press on your final wheel. So far, so good. Check. Sufficient side play. Check again. Insulated wheels, insulated wheels, insulated wheels, all on the same side. Turn the cranks. 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 3 o'clock. Nice and square. That centre wheel nice and free, no friction. We're ready next to fit the pickups, wire up the motor and see how she starts to run.